Hey everybody, JMac here in another Refactor Friday. First, let me apologize because I totally forgot it was Friday. The morning was a little busy, and by the time I realized it was early afternoon, so I didn't figure it made sense to do the live stream, um, just because it would have been kind of haphazard and unannounced. So I'll try to be better about scheduling that next week in the morning as I have done in the past. But nonetheless, I still wanted to record something for this week because there was a refactor that actually came about during some coaching that I was doing earlier in the week. So coaching is something I do with a few developers kind of per month. The time slots actually fill up pretty quickly. But it's basically a chance for you to, or for us to pair up together and kind of work on something, figure things out, clean up code, write tests, whatever it might be, whatever you're working on. Because, honestly, pair programming, it's faster. A lot of people think that, oh, well, two developers on one thing is going to be slower, but I just see so many devs, and I know myself, I used to really bang my head against the wall for hours and hours and hours trying to fix something that, when you pair up with somebody else and put two heads on it, like, you just get it done so much faster, and the quality is also a lot higher because, again, you're either testing or you're kind of seeing the loopholes each other kind of has, just kind of some human testing, even if you're not writing, actual code or automated tests. So, what came out of it, though, was actually something relating to Laravel specifically, as you can see kind of here on the documentation page, particularly around Eloquent and collections. So Eloquent's the ORM within Laravel. This isn't necessarily super Laravel specific, to be honest. It's really kind of any framework or any ORM potentially. So if you're not familiar with Laravel, don't shy away just yet. I think there's still some stuff to get out of it. So with that said, let's actually kind of look at the code. And I've anonymized this a little bit. This is kind of the rough idea. So let me walk through this and kind of everything's here in this just little sample PHP script that I've kind of put back together and kind of recreated again just to make sure everything was kind of anonymous. But the general ideas here and the overall refactor is what I want to demonstrate. So basically what was going on was there was a splash page where they needed to show basically some specials. And these specials were kind of by stores, which were by region, which were by market. So kind of think of like a national chain, right? So we could just say something like Wendy's. And Wendy's has locations all across probably the world, but United States. And so maybe they have something in the Southwest region, and then certain stores within that Southwest region are going to run a very certain special. But from, let's say, an administrative view or a marketing view, they might want to see, okay, well, what regions are running a certain special? And as we can already kind of tell based on the description, kind of figuring out the back and forth flow between that relationship can get a little bit hairy. You're jumping two or three relationships to try to figure out, the overall data that you need, right? To get the overall data that you need. And because of that jumping, it's not that you couldn't do this with an ORM, it's just that it's a little bit cumbersome. So they actually had this working, but it was very procedural and very heavy from the perspective of the data that they were collecting. And again, there was nothing, wrong with this. It worked, but it was really a matter of, how could this be cleaned up to kind of achieve it in a better way, in a more efficient way potentially. And in fact, they actually did have some small edge case bugs when they started looking at different regions. So it wasn't working 100%, but the point is that the solution was close. It probably just needed a few more if statements, and it probably would have been there. But nonetheless, I think there is a better way to do this, which we ended up kind of refactoring it towards. And I think there's even additional refactors you can do from there. But let me just demonstrate this initial bit. So kind of at a high level, we have our description of regions and stores and specials, and the overall goal is basically to show the regions running that special. And so we're kind of looping over all the specials and you can just kind of think like off in the corner we're saying, southwest region, northwest region, south region or east coast region or whatever it is, right? And the problem actually, one of the bugs they had was actually that it was duplicating those regions based on this code here. So the first thing I want to kind of address is that ORMs are awesome. So again, this isn't the fault of the developer. It's not the fault of the framework. It's not the fault of an ORM. ORMs are, an abstraction layer, and as such, they give up a little bit of some of those specialized edge cases to provide, again, I guess developer happiness, if you will, for the majority. But this is probably, again, pushing the boundaries of an ORM. And so there's a couple different solutions here. A lot of the times when I have something very, very specific, some developers, I think, well, I guess backing up a second, not necessarily what I do, but most developers, and maybe in the past I might have done this, is, they might jump out and just kind of try to write some kind of, raw SQL, query, to get everything, that they need. So they would step outside of the ORM. And that's entirely a possibility. Again, that's that surgical edge case where you can do this approach, be very precise for what you need, get it back out, and kind of go from there. And that actually might, to be fair, from a performance or efficiency database perspective, that might actually be the best approach. But sticking inside of ORM, a lot of the times you can adopt what's called kind of this, you know, divide and stitch. So it's like this divide and stitch pattern. And really, what I kind of think of that as, whoops, stitch. If I can spell stitch, there we go. Really, you can kind of think of that as a way, said another way, I like to call that, collect the raw data. And when I say raw data, I'm really kind of like, if we think of this from like a mining analogy, what I'm after is I want the raw materials, right? I don't want the prefabricated chair. I want the wood and even like the steel to kind of put that chair together myself, so to speak. So again, there are opportunities to potentially try to mine it and have it all prefabricated and done for you with a very, very, very deep, SQL, raw SQL query. But I think that kind of defeats the purpose of potentially the ORM. It's going to be very complex. It's going to be very brittle because it's only going to do that one thing. And this page particularly did have other things it needed to display. It needed to display the specials. It needed to display things about the stores. It needed additional data. If you only needed analytic type information like IDs or counts, then by all means that custom query is probably the way to go. But as a display page on kind of a web application, this needed a lot more bits of data. So anytime I kind of have those requirements, my mind goes to like, okay, let's keep the raw data. Let's just mine for the raw data and get that, and then from there we can build what we need using those materials. Now that doesn't mean necessarily to be, completely cavalier and, do something like get all the regions. We should still be, as specific as possible. Whoops. Get all the regions, right? Like this isn't necessarily what we want to do. We still want to be specific as we can to kind of limit that data. We want to be efficient. We don't just want to hammer the database for every single possible record. So that's not necessarily what I mean by raw data. I still want to collect the specific materials. I'm not going to go cut down, kind of sticking with that chair analogy. I'm not going to go cut down all the different species of trees and wood. If I want an oak chair, I'm going to go get the raw oak tree necessarily. So there's a balance there is the point. Hopefully the analogy is, I'm kind of in an analogy mood today, so hopefully those are coming across okay. But anyways, what they were originally doing, and again, this worked, so I don't want to harp on this by any means, but what they were originally doing is they were kind of very kind of sequentially, you can see the thought process as it's occurring here. Okay, let's get all the region IDs, let's get all the stores that are open inside of that region, and then let's go get all the specials for that particular, get all the specials that are in those different stores, right? So we kind of we went all the way down. But the problem is the requirement is to show the regions running that special. So now we kind of have to go all the way back out. So even though we're listing all the specials in that particular market, it's one of those things where we need to now go back and show the kind of higher level specials. So everything's being listed out, but it's kind of this in-between relationship here between the stores going back to the regions and then going back down to kind of the specials that are being run within those stores. And there's some extra things here, like I mentioned, make sure that the region's, online and available, right? Maybe that region hasn't opened yet. Same with the stores, make sure the store is actually open, it's not closed for renovations or being built or anything like that. And also, of course, the special hasn't ended. It's a special that's still running, right? And then they kind of did some extra queries here where they kind of got you can tell they went back and got the raw regions and they kind of went back and got the raw stores as well. So they've basically got all the bits of data that they needed. They got very specific with specials, but then they kind of went back and made some additional queries to then loop over and kind of have these nested for each loops to kind of rebuild all of that data back together. And again, this works, nothing's wrong with this. The ultimate result, let's just kind of demonstrate that, is basically this like specials array that basically gives us an array just for kind of some pseudo, JSON, PHP kind of array here. But basically this would be the special ID here, and then that would be basically an array of a subarray of all the different locations. Regions. So this would be regions, region 1, region 2, and whatnot. And these are actually underneath, these are actually the kind of objects. So let's just kind of make a little rough object notation here. So this is basically a indexed array by the special ID, and then inside of there, it shows each of the regions that have that special ID. So that's our ultimate goal. This is essentially what the view expected. So when they were looping over the specials, they could just look immediately in this kind of this map or this translation array of the specials regions or whatever. And then basically they could pull out the regions that are in there, loop over those to show them as a list or buttons or links or whatever it was. So this is our ultimate goal. So let's kind of go back. So let's go back to that raw bit here. So right away, I can see that there are definitely some extra queries that are happening here. So the first thing I want to do is get back again to that raw data. So this thing where I'm plucking out IDs to kind of build up the specials, this can actually be done in a more efficient way. So right away, we can actually backtrack a little bit and turn these into regions and just simply get again, our raw data. We still want to be specific and honor the filtering that's happening here, the where clauses and so forth that already existed. But instead of immediately kind of plucking out those IDs to get kind of all of them down here, all of these right here, and kind of trickle that all the way down to specials, we can just go ahead and get all of our raw regions, because we know that any region in here is potentially going to be a region that gets found down here. So it won't have any less regions, I guess you could say, than that. So it's probably gonna hold some extra regions, but it will at least contain the regions that the specials would reference because of kind of, again, that trickle down approach. But we can avoid that extra query. So let's get rid of that. And same thing with stores. We can avoid the extra query for stores, and we can just turn this into a get. But now we need to change these to, say, regions, and we can just do our pluck inline here. And this is just a helper method in Laravel. But again, pluck's pretty common in a lot of different languages to kind of take an array of objects, an array of values, get a very particular key out of there, and turn that into kind of a subarray. So we can get all the basically region IDs by using this pluck method. So we don't need to do a special query for that, and we definitely don't need to rerun these queries down here to get a larger data set because of, kind of set arithmetic. We know that this is all going to work correctly. So even though this might be a bit of a larger set than we need ultimately, it's okay because it will definitely contain everything that we need, but also at the same time not contain more than we need, meaning all of the regions and all of the stores ever in the huge database. So theoretically, this is a pretty small set. Again, there might be other ways. If you're dealing with really large data, you may need to jump to that specialized query, but didn't need to in this case. So this gives us our raw data. So we basically took 5 queries, and in fact, they had a few more to be fair, but I kind of broke this down so it was digestible. So they had about 5 queries there, 2 of which were basically doing the same thing, just with less filtering. So we can, again, by kind of set arithmetic, we can take just what we need here, but get the raw data instead of the very specific IDs. So now we can kind of use that directly, but cut down on the overall number of queries. We would still have the same for each bit here, but there was an opportunity to kind of clean this up in a couple different ways. Again, mainly because there was an assumption made that because they were using methods like pluck and so forth, they were already somewhat familiar with the collection methods inside of the framework. Again, in this case, Laravel. But any language has these, any framework probably has these. In fact, outside of PHP, I know they definitely exist in things like Ruby, and Python are much better about these like collection pipeline style methods. JavaScript, same thing. Lodash is a great example in JavaScript that you can use to kind of have all sorts of similar methods. So Laravel gives us these collection methods, and again, based on the fact that they were using pluck and some other things I noticed in the code, they seem to be familiar with them, and so because of that, these for eaches seemed like they could be, done in kind of a cleaner way. So let's take a look at these. We basically have a for each here that has a nested for each inside of it, and anytime I see that where I'm basically, kind of filtering these or accumulating something within this for each loop, there's definitely an opportunity to use a collection method. And in this case, all of this, let's just make some code comments here to kind of divide and conquer as I teach in base code. So this is basically filter, and this is basically filter regions, and we basically have filter stores. So we can rewrite this to basically say stores filter, and we can do our little closer here where we get the store, and we can already see how it's taking the structure, and we basically just want to return a truthy value for anything that kind of makes sense that we want to be or pass our filter, right? So if it passes the filter, then that's going to be a set of stores that we get back. So we could actually, in this case, we're actually getting back regions. So we can say like, let's see, what do we want to call this? I'm going to call it R for now. I don't want to get too stuck there. Let's finish out what I was talking about with the filter bit here. So we can just take that condition quite simply there, and we're basically going to filter the stores, return those stores that basically would match that particular region, right? So we're kind of accumulating the regions directly here, but there's a little bit of a difference here, and we'll get to that here in just a second. So let's take care of that. And let's do the same thing down here with filtering out those locations. So this is, let's call this stores within region, or sorry, stores with specials. There we go. So that's a little bit more of what we're after. So the goal here is to filter stores with specials. And so we'll just use this for the variable name for now. And now we basically would want to filter out the locations. So filter out locations within those stores region. Okay, so that's effectively what we're doing down here. We're basically getting the regions with that special by previously looping over those RIDs. Those RIDs aren't explicit anymore. We actually get a collection of objects here. So this would actually, instead of giving us before like 1, 2, 3, 4, this would actually give us a collection. We're actually going to filter out those entire store objects. So this is actually going to be like store, region, region 1 and store. Hopefully my kind of object notation here makes sense. This would be region 3 and so on. The next one would be 4. So you get the idea. So we get this instead of those raw IDs. So keep that in mind. But we can apply the same thing down here where we basically say regions. So this is effectively our regions with specials. And we can say regions. And we would filter function region. And inside of here, we would just return the same concept where our, So instead of this straight in array, it's a little bit different now because we don't have these RIDs. So what we really have here is a collection. So we can actually use another collection method, and we can say something along the lines of stores with specials contains a region ID of the particular region that we have. And with PHP to be proper, we'll actually need to pass in a reference to this particular collection. And now we would be able to get rid of this as well. So not necessarily too much here that we've broken out just yet, but the point here is that we're getting a little closer, right? And there is something to be said for these as far as their readability. It's something I would agree that you definitely have to get a little bit used to. Some people might not consider this kind of a better approach, a quote-unquote better approach, or a more readable approach, which again is immensely important to me. But I also think there's a learning curve, and I think once you become more familiar with this style of kind of imperative versus declarative, functional, if you will, type style of programming, it's one of those things where it is actually something that feels a little more readable, and you can always encapsulate this in some kind of helper method to make it a little less noisy, right? You can kind of just push that off and say, oh, get me the regions for this special, and pass in the appropriate data. We also have a lot of comments here for right now, which I'm going to get rid of here in just a second. So this actually gives us, again, another regions, but it's going to give us all of those region objects, and we haven't really broken it out into that specials thing. So that's kind of the final approach here, where we can even turn this whole thing into a collection. So we no longer need this RIDs. We no longer need our comments. I'm going to go ahead and rip those out. We can actually just kind of start to pack this down, and we can basically take this outer bit, loop over all the specials, and we can use something called map with keys to give us kind of that larger array. And this is going to basically take a special, and we are going to have to use the regions, and what else do we need? We also need stores. And then let's get the proper syntax running here. And now, if we change this to be instead of returning that directly, we could return a array, because that's what map with keys wants. It basically wants a subarray that's going to get packed down into a larger array. And so now we have an opportunity to do this kind of subarray, which I mentioned earlier. So this is going to be, our key needs to be special. To create that same structure, it needs to be the special ID, and the result is going to be an array of whatever regions got filtered out based on our previous work. So we can close that up, and let's just break this down so it's a little easier to kind of see all that. And it looks like my beautifier is not working, so I either have a syntax error, or maybe that's just not how beautify works. Anyways, let's break this in myself, just so it's a little cleaner. There we go. That's a little better. Okay, cool. And instead of that defaulting, we would just run this back here. So it's a little bit tighter. There's still some more opportunities. We could actually take this filter stores and we could get rid of this temp variable by just kind of chaining this even farther. And we could reference, I believe you can do something like referencing of this, which would be the outside calling. Again, I am not super familiar with collection kind of pipelines going that far, but there's definitely a way to pack these two together. So I'll kind of just leave that as homework if anybody wants to mention that in the comments. But this basically gave us what we want, and this opportunity was afforded to us by the fact that we did the raw data. So the key takeaways here are basically don't worry about trying, if you're using an ORM, don't worry about trying to craft the specific chain of ORM methods to kind of get what you need. A lot of times that can be very difficult. But on the other end of the extreme is also a scenario where you kind of use the ORM to selectively get all these tiny little things, and then you're trying to kind of have to make it do something that, again, it wasn't really designed to do. And so again, a lot of the times people will kind of abandon the ORM completely and just use a raw SQL statement, which is fine if you have a very specific result set that you're after. But in this case, we still needed to display a lot of different things, a lot of different meta information around the specials and around the regions. So getting just the IDs or getting just the specials wasn't enough because in the view, they were effectively using ORM to then load a different, load kind of some relationships across multiple relationships. So they were going from specials or from that special back to the particular store, and then they were getting like the regions. Um, and what this effectively created or led to was the whole kind of n+1 problem where it's like, okay, I got my specials, but now for every special, I'm getting every region over and over and over and over again. And it ended up being a far more expensive operation than to the point I'm making, which is just collect the raw data and then basically build it yourself, right? So get the raw pieces that you need, not the super raw stuff, but kind of right in between. There's a bit of an art there, a bit of a Goldilocks scenario. But if you simplify these, use the ORM and just get the sets, the raw sets of data that you need, right? The raw data sets, let's call them. So sets. Then you can kind of build up what you need yourself. And with that raw data, maybe depending on your ORM, depending on your language, depending on your framework, you might have an opportunity to leverage some fancier collection methods, which are going to do this a little bit, I don't want to use the word cleaner, but maybe a little more effectively than having to do, again, these very low-level for each loops with lots of logic contained inside of them and deeply nested. Again, this is nested code, but there is a possibility to chain this, and there also is an opportunity to learn more about these within your language, within your framework. So you can write, you can tackle more complex problems. So always good to have additional tools in the toolbox, even if, it may or may not be the appropriate time to use them. So that's today's refactor. Again, sorry for the missing out on the live stream. I'll make sure things are scheduled and prepared a little better for next week. I'll set a little reminder. But again, wanted to get something just kind of quick out there. Hopefully this was helpful to kind of see a refactor, kind of one of the larger refactors that we stumbled upon during the week during some coaching. So thanks again. Leave your comments again, especially if you've got some tips on reworking this. I'd gladly welcome them. So hit them up on the YouTube comments or just send me your little code snippet refactor, even better, on Twitter. So see you all next week.